Haunted Ohio by Chris Woodyard. Vol.1, Chapter 9. Resting in Pieces. Disembodied Spirits. Are we not spirits that are shaped into a body? Some ghosts have a difficult time pulling themselves together. Decapitated, fragmented, or shattered, they wander in searching for their better halves with lanterns and candles, or simply groping in the dark. Come the last day and the resurrection of the body, perhaps they'll find themselves. Ohio's Sleepy Hollow. Bellbrook was once called Ohio's Sleepy Hollow because of the reputation it had for ghosts and strange legends. It, too, has a headless ghost. James Buckley was an Englishman who built a sawmill along Sugar Creek, then known as Possum Run Creek, in Bellbrook. The sawmill prospered, and Buckley became a wealthy man. Someone who coveted the gold coins hidden in his cabin waylaid him on the road, struck off his head, and left the corpse bleeding in the dust. The head was discovered in the road, filthy and unrecognizable, the hair matted with blood. The murderer was never caught, and it was whispered that Buckley's cabin was haunted. Local residents avoided it, and so the new owner rented it to an unsuspecting Dayton couple. Shortly after they moved in, the wife ran into the village screaming that a man with his head under his arm was standing at her door. Buckley's ghost walks down the little Sugar Creek, holding out his arms, imploring passers-by for help. Deep Cut Ghost. Many headless ghosts begin their careers by being robbed and murdered. Now they wander seeking their heads and revenge on their killers. The headless ghost of Deep Cut between Old Washington and Cambridge in US 40 was a laborer who worked on the National Road. He saved most of his earnings, a fact noted by several of his workmates. One payday he disappeared and was never seen again until his apparition began frightening horses around the road. His murderers had shoveled his headless body under tons of road fill. It now lies entombed under concrete and asphalt, but the laborer's ghost still stumbles across Route 40, caught in the headlights of passing cars. The Headless Conductor of Moonville. A headless railroad conductor walks the line near the ghost town of Moonville in Zalaski State Forest. Moonville sprung up around the local iron furnaces over 100 years ago, but all that is left is an old railroad tunnel and some traces of when the tracks were run, and some traces where the tracks once ran. The story goes that a B&O conductor was having an affair with an engineer's wife. Insane with jealousy, the engineer asked the conductor to check something under the train, then ran him over, slicing off his head. The track still exists today. It's the most godforsaken stretch of the B&O Railroad between St. Louis and Parksburg, according to George Toiver, who remembers walking the tracks between Mineral and Moonville. The railroad tracks went through 2 tunnels and over 4 trestles. There were no roads, so you had to walk the tracks to get between the 2 villages. If you got trapped in a tunnel or on a trestle, it would be your last trip. Tolliver recalls noting that he himself nearly died on the trestle about 80 years ago. He heard many tales of the ghost. Most described him as a colored man, 8 feet tall, looking like he was walking on stilts. a miner's cap with an oil lamp on his hand with flames flowing back over his shoulder, always walking down the track. Others have heard the conductor's last screams. Some see his red and green lantern bobbing along the tracks as he weaves through the forest looking for his head. When he finds it, the engineer will have hell to pay. Ghost on Lady Bend Hill. Lady Bend Hill on Route 40 in Belmont County is haunted by the ghost of a headstrong and headless woman who died after an argument with her lover. The young woman galloped away in rage, even though a storm threatened. She was decapitated by a bolt of lightning, and her body was never found. Now she startles motorists on the third bend from the top of the hill, appearing as a headless woman mounted side saddle on a ghostly white horse, which streaks down the road like lightning. A stagecoach driver who saw her on New Year's Day, 1896, a day of record-breaking cold, related that he saw a headless woman rider floating in the icy air. He whipped his team, but was senseless with fear by the time they reached their destination. The Headless Indian. The Riddle School on Township Route 593 was built in 1886. Now the Catanoa Community Club, it was named for Catatonia, an Indian who was very friendly towards early Ashland County settlers. Despite this, a settler who believed that the only good Injun is a dead Injun beheaded Catatawan and threw his head into a stream. On dark and misty nights, Catatawan's headless ghost, blood spurting from the ragged stump on his neck, wanders blindly by the stream which now bears his name. The 100th Skull. In the early part of the century, Bill Quick, trapper and frontiersman, lived in a cabin on the upper Sentito, not far from the present town of Kenton. As he returned from hunting one evening, he found his cabin ransacked and his father dead in a pool of congealed blood, a raw strip of flesh where his head had once been. Quick swore an oath on a jug of hard cider that he would revenge his father's death 100-fold. All the Indians grew to fear him, the death that walked in darkness. They never knew how or when he would take his revenge, by a knife-flashing death from beyond the trees, by a bullet as they lay down their weapons to paddle across a river, or by axe that clove off their skulls as they slept. Hideous fruit to be placed in a sack and carried home. Bill Quick worked as well as his name, but unlike his enemies, the scalp was not enough. He took the whole head, burying it in the ground until it was bright as a wolf's tooth. Then he would add the skull to the row of 99 ghastly trophies grinning down at him from a ledge in his cabin. But the terrified Indians were moving to safer lands by the lakes, and the ones who remained were warier. Before Quick could complete his revenge, he was seized with black water fever. He called his son Tom to him and pointed a shaking finger at the skulls. "Finish what I have started," he whispered. "If you fail, my father and I will rise from our graves and haunt you until the 100th skull is taken." Trembling, Tom promised. Bill Quick died and was buried. Unlike his father, Tom was a poor shot and had no taste for blood. Day after day he put off fulfilling his promise. He sat in the cabin and drank until it seemed like the skulls were gibbering and cackling their teeth at him like chat and mockery. Soon everyone knew that Tom had sworn to kill an Indian, and everyone laughed at the sluggard. One night, when Tom had been drinking more heavily than usual, a group of friends reported that a band of Indians was in the area. They ridiculed him and taunted his manhood until he picked up his rifle and staggered out of the cabin in search of the last skull. Riding home, his friends heard a shot fire. They laughed and cheered. The next morning they called upon Tom, congratulating him. Knocking brought no answer. They pushed the door open. The 100th skull stood in place reserved for it, as bright as ivory, with a bullet hole in its forehead. Tom Quick's headless body lay beneath it. The ghostly hand. In April 1958, a ghostly hand drove a family out of their apartment on Manson Court in Cleveland. The Lees moved into the apartment in November of 1957. Immediately they were disturbed by mysterious moans and groans and screams from the basement. The following March, Miss Lee bravely decided to investigate. She descended through the trap door into the basement. It was a nightmare of clutter, with piles of broken furniture looking like monsters in the darkened corners. Miss Lee slowly walked around, wondering if they had just imagined the noises. In the gloom, something stark white caught her eye. It was a bloody hand thrusting rigidly through the debris, the stiff fingers clawing at the air. Miss Lee went berserk and ran screaming from the house. Lee thought his hysterical wife was exaggerating. There had to be some perfectly normal explanation. Sitting in the kitchen, trying to soothe her, he watched as the basement trap door lifted under his wife's feet and she fell. "Who's there?" Lee shouted, trying to see through the darkness below the door. He searched the basement. There was no one there. Lee raced upstairs and nailed down the door. The next day, the family moved out. Lee couldn't get anyone to believe his story, so on March 31st, he took some friends to the apartment with him. As Lee told his story in the kitchen, the trap door burst open, splintering the wood where it had been nailed down. Terrified, they all ran into the living room. There they saw ghostly fingers wriggling at them through the holes in the floor. Lee called the police. They saw the holes in the floor, the wrecked trap door, but they found nothing tangible to account for any of it. The police officer said he heard something that sounded like dirt being shoveled in the basement. The Lees never returned to that house. Lee later talked to the neighbors, who told him that a husband and a wife lived in the apartments years ago. They quarreled violently. The husband told the neighbors that his wife had run off and then he moved away. The wife was never seen again in her entirety. The rumor was that the husband had murdered and dismembered his wife and hidden the parts in the basement. The case was investigated by ghost hunter Hans Holz in 1963, but the only spirits he found were fumes hanging around a dark drunk who was sleeping it off in the house. A half-there haunting. One night in November, D. Bellows was the only person working late at Creek Realty in Beaver Creek. He was getting some copy paper out of a cabinet in the back room when he heard a noise, a knock or a bump, like the front door opening. He started to straighten up. "Hello?" called Bellows, thinking that a colleague had come in the back door. As he spoke, in the doorway he saw a person dressed in a calf-length black dress and high-button in high-button 1890s shoes. The trouble was, the person was only half there, from the thighs down. Between the time I said hello and completely straightened up was the only microsecond, but it was gone. I walked into the hall to see what I had seen. I walked into the hall to see where what I'd seen had gone. I felt a cold draft go across my face, but the back door was shut. Bellows explained that the pneumatic door closer took 8 seconds to close. That is a weird sentence. Bellows explained that the pneumatic door closer took 8 seconds to close and had only taken about 2 to cover the 8 feet back to the door. He stood there, baffled. Then jarringly the phone rang. In shock, Bellows croaked, "Hello," instead of the standard, "Good evening, Creek Realty." "Have I reached Creek Realty?" asked the caller. Completely rattled, Bellows blurted, "I'm sorry, I just saw a ghost." The caller, who was one of his co-workers, laughed. At her suggestion, the ghost was dubbed Esmeralda. Someone else in the office suggested that the ghost was a displaced phantom. A historic log cabin next door had just been torn apart for removal. Bellows couldn't bring himself to ask if any leg bones had been found in the rubble. Nonplussed, Bellows still shakes his head about the event. "I didn't want to, or expect to, or need to see anything like that. It was really weird. I don't talk to things I don't see," he says empathetically, which to D. Bellows means that something only half there, or possibly present only in spirit, visited Creek Realty that November night. The spectral skeleton of the Great Black Swamp. In Myths and Legends of Our Native Land, Charles M. Skinner tells a ghastly tale of a dismembered skeleton in the Great Black Swamp. 2 miles south of Munger, Ohio, in the heart of what used to be called the Black Swamp, stood the Woodbury House, a roomy mansion long gone to decay. John Cleves, the last to live in it, was a man whose evil practices got him sent to the penitentiary. Penitentiary? But people had never associated him with the queer sights and sounds in the lower chambers, nor with the fact that a man named Sims, who had gone into the house in 1842, has never been known to leave it. 10 years after Sims' disappearance, it happened that Mayor Ward and his friend Joe Stowe had occasion to take shelter there for the night. It being then deserted, and starting a blaze in the parlor fireplace, they lit their pipes and talked till late. Stowe would have preferred a happier topic, but the mayor, who feared neither man nor devil, contentedly turned to talk on the evil reputation of the house. While they chatted, a door opened with a creak, and a human skeleton appeared before them. "What do you want? Speak!" cries Ward. But waiting for no reply, he drew his pistol and fired 2 shots at the grisly object. There was a rattling sound, but the skeleton was neither dislocated nor disconcerted. Advancing deliberately with upraised arm, it said in a husky voice, "I, that am dead, yet live in the sense that mortals do not know. In my earthly life I was James Sims, who was robbed and killed here in my sleep by John Cleves." With bony finger it pointed to a rugged gap in its left temple. "Cleves cut off my head and buried it under the hearth. My body he cast to his well. At these words the head disappeared, and the voice was heard beneath the floor. Take up my skull. The watchers obeyed the call, and after digging a minute beneath the hearth, a fleshless head with a wound in the left temple came to view. Ward took it up in his hands, but in a twinkling it left them and disappeared onto the shoulders of the skeleton. I have long wanted to tell my fate, it resumed, but could not tell until one should be found brave enough to speak to me. I have appeared to many, but you are the first who has commanded me to break my long silence. Give my bones a decent burial. Write to my relative Gilmore Sims of Columbus, Georgia, and tell him that I have revealed, I have found peace. With a graceful gesture, it extended its hands to Ward, who, as he took it, shook like one with an ague. His wrist locked in its bony clasp. As it released him, it raised its hands impressively. A bluish light burned at the doorway for an instant. The two men found themselves alone. Ghastly, ghostly odors. The ghost of an odor? It seems impossible, but phantom scents are a noticeable, if elusive, form of psychic manifestation. A whiff of rose perfume announces the presence of the ghost of Dayton's Victoria Theater. A ghostly gingerbread smell haunts the Stephen House in Waynesville. Guides at the Patterson homestead in Dayton have experienced homey but mysterious odors of baking cookies and fresh green beans. But not all phantom scents are so pleasant. Two women students, Chrissy and Lisa, experienced an appalling odor in their dorm room at Miami University. The dorm, originally part of a women's college, had burned down several times. Reputedly, a male student who had been visiting his girlfriend illicitly died after he concealed himself in a closet when the alarms went off. This is the stuff of student folklore. But what these two women experienced was all too real. It began with a horrible odor in their closet. Lisa described it as a sickening, like rotting sausage. It was both sweet and corrupt, the smell of decaying human flesh. Chrissy first thought that there must be a dead mouse in the wall, but the horror did not confine itself to the closet. It lingered there for a day or two, and then it moved into the room itself. Chrissy and Lisa were appalled by the stench. Their friends also noticed the smell, which was strong only in a certain area. "You could walk through it," said Lisa, "like through a circle and come out the other side." The circle, with its unbearable odor, moved around the room, changing its position daily. It edged closer and closer to the door, and then, at last, it moved into the hall just outside the girls' room, and mercifully it disappeared. Dead and gone. From the Western Star, August 27th, 1891, comes a story about the most disembodied of phantoms. Charles J. Reed, a young man of 25 years, living in Xenia, fell dead recently while walking across the dining room in his father's house. The family were presented at the breakfast table. The family were present at the breakfast table when Charles entered the room. He had passed the table, but only a few steps when he fell heavily to the floor and never again breathed. The body was carried into the bedroom, and after vain efforts at resurrection, left lying on the bed with composed limbs and covered face. In the mealtime, the boy had been dispatched for a physician, who arrived some 20 minutes after death. He afterwards remembered that when he arrived, the weeping relatives, father, mother, and 2 sisters, were all in the room out of which the bedroom opened, and that the door was closed. There was no other bedroom. This door was at once opened by the father of the deceased, and as the physician passed through it, he observed the rigid outline of the body under the sheet that had been thrown over it. And the profile was plain discernible, sick under the face cloth, clear cut and sharp, as profiles of the dead always seem to be. He approached the cloth and lifted. There was nothing there. He pulled away the sheet. Nothing. The family had followed him into the room. At this astonishing discovery, if so it may be called, they looked at one another, at the physician, at the bed, in speechless amazement. A moment later, the 3 ladies required the physician's care. All had fainted and had fallen to the floor. The father's condition was but a little better. He stood in a stupor, muttering inarticulately, and staring like an idiot. Having restored the ladies to consciousness, the physician went to the window, the only one the room had. It was locked on the inside with the usual fastening attached to the bottom of the bottom bar of the upper sash. No inquest was held. There was nothing to hold on it. But the physician and many others who were curious about the remarkable occurrence made the most searching investigation, but without result. Charles J. Reed was dead and gone, and that is all that there ever has been known of it to this day.